There's been a lot of booing and a tremendous amount of disrespect to those who pull guard.
Oh, you suck!
But not from you. You're here because you know guard retention is one of the most difficult things to learn in jiu-jitsu, and you appreciate when it's done well. And I've spent the past few weeks studying amazing guard players like Levi to see if I can find any takeaways to help improve my own guard retention. And in this video, I'm going to share what I found to be most helpful. In the words of Greg Sodders, the goal of the guard player is to make and maintain connection with the purpose of managing distance and destabilizing their opponent. But open guard is a very dynamic position with a lot of movement, and it can be difficult for the guard player to make that initial connection. And this is the primary problem that I'm going to solve for you in this video. However, it can be difficult to learn guard retention concepts in the dynamic environment of open guard. So I found it helpful to practice guard retention concepts from half guard, as it's a more static position. And then I try and apply those same concepts to the more dynamic position of open guard. Therefore, I've structured this video to start off talking about half guard, and then we'll progress to open guard retention. From half guard, it's important to distinguish between our far arm and our near arm. The primary responsibility of our far arm is framing, and its primary focus is preventing our opponent from pinning us flat on the mat. While our far arm is framing, our near arm is looking to establish an initial connection. Whether it's our opponent's upper body or lower body, we're just looking to make some initial connection with our near arm. Now, to compromise the structure of our far side arm frame, the guard passer is going to be looking to create a situation where our elbow is outside the line of our ribs, allowing them to take a far side underhook and pin our back flat to the mat. So while they're trying to bring our elbow outside of our ribs, we're trying to keep our elbow in line with our ribs to maintain a solid frame with our outside arm. And with a structured frame in place, this gives us the freedom to make an initial connection with our near arm. And then we can look to incorporate our far arm to make a more robust connection.
If I keep a tight elbow first with my top elbow, when she goes to punch that underhook in, it's impossible. And I can easily take the hand off. As she goes to reclaim that hand positioning, I just feed it back across, and now we're with a 2-on-1 elbow or 2-on-1 wrist.
Now things start to get a bit more nuanced when we incorporate our lower body, because now if we have a structured frame in place with our lower body, we can start to be a bit more cavalier with our far side arm. But if our opponent is past our lower body frames, we really need to be disciplined with our far side arm and prioritize using that far side arm to make it difficult for our opponent to put us flat on our back. And from there, we can look to reestablish our lower body frames, which would now give us the freedom to use our far side arm to make connection. So from half guard, the primary goal of the far arm is to frame, and the primary goal of the near arm is to make an initial connection. And as long as we're confident in our lower body frames, then we can start to use our far arm to make a more robust connection. So no matter how fancy it looks, the general idea is the far arm is responsible for framing, and the near arm is the one that's responsible to make the initial connection. Now as we start to transition from half guard into a more open guard scenario, the biggest difference is mobility, and it can be very hard for us to make the initial connection and slow the guard passer down. So to make that initial connection, we're going to use the same concepts that we talked about from half guard. We have a far arm and we have a near arm, and the primary responsibility of the far arm is to frame, while the near arm is the one that's responsible for making that initial connection. But a lot of times from open guard, our opponent is going to be too far away for us to effectively frame with our outside arm. And by the time they get close enough for our outside arm to be used as a frame, they're already so deep on a guard pass, it's tough for us to recover. So we know we want to use our outside arm as a frame, but the problem is they're too far away for us to frame against them. So instead, what we look to do is frame against ourselves in what's called a self frame. Now the primary goal of the guard passer is to make our feet and knees face away from them. So the goal of the self frame is to support the structure of our legs, making it difficult for the guard passer to achieve this. Here we see Felipe Pena is square with Gordon, whose hips are flat on the mat, which means Gordon has yet to establish a far arm or a near arm, which is why he takes two symmetrical self frames on each side. But once Felipe Pena picks a side, now Gordon Ryan has a far arm and a near arm. And that far arm is prioritizing framing Felipe away, while Gordon's near arm is the one that establishes the initial connection. Now, if Gordon were to start in a situation where his hips are not square, but instead he's on one hip, now his far arm and near arm are established. And because Felipe Pena is at distance, Gordon is using his far arm as a self-frame. Generally, I see this type of self-frame where you hug your knee into your own chest when you're on one hip. From a situation like this where the guard passer is grabbing your ankle, it can be very tempting to try and connect with your far arm, but this is risky and can lead to them getting very deep into guard passes. So instead, I've really been trying to use my outside arm as a frame to support the structure of my own legs, and the goal of the near arm is to make that initial connection. And once that initial connection is made, you look at your lower body situation, and if it's one that you're comfortable with, you can now remove your far arm as a frame and use it to make a more robust connection. At this point, I think a good question would be, what is considered good lower body positioning? Because having good lower body positioning is what frees our far arm up to make connection. Now, there are many from open guard, but there are two I want to focus on in this video. The first is you're able to use what I've been calling a low leg and bring your near leg to your opponent's lead hip. Here we see Levi framing away with his far arm and making connection with his near arm, as he's working to low leg to connect to his opponent's lead hip. As Levi's foot is almost getting out, he lets go of his frame and transitions to connection with his far arm. But as PJ stuffs that foot back down, Levi's far arm transitions back to framing. So although not much happened in this sequence, I think it does a really good job of showing Levi's intentions and the order of operations that he prefers to maintain a very disciplined guard. Here you can see Levi's hips are square, so he's using his far arm as a kickstand self-frame. And as soon as he's able to low leg and get his foot to the lead hip of his opponent, he lets go of that self-frame with his far arm and switches to a much more offensive grip. The second form of lower body positioning we're looking for is a lasso. You can see as Joseph switches sides, Levi quickly throws in his lasso. And now he's no longer looking to frame with his outside arm, but instead is making connection. Now generally, a lasso is not all that robust without the gi. And as soon as you throw in a lasso, people can just pull their arm out and continue to pass. But Levi uses a very interesting grip behind the tricep. This grip makes the lasso much more sticky. And now if Joseph tries to switch sides without clearing the lasso, it keeps Levi aligned. And things start to get very interesting when we combine the lasso with the low leg. Here we can see Mateus initially framing with his far arm to throw in his lasso. And once his lasso's in place, now instead of pulling behind that same tricep, he pulls behind the opposite tricep. But either way, he's now using his far arm to make connection instead of frame. But that's only because he had good lower body position in the form of a lasso. And he uses that connection to pull Gary forward as he throws in his low leg and starts to enter into K-guard. Here we see Levi's not able to throw in a full-blown lasso, but it's a frame nonetheless. And this frees up his far arm to take a 2-on-1 grip. And you can see Levi trying to low leg, but Joseph is denying his lead hip. And now with no lower body connection in place, Levi lets go of his grip and goes back to square one. So once we have our lower body in place, there's a lot of places we can look to connect with our far arm. We can grab behind their near tricep. We can grab behind their far tricep. We can grab their wrist. Or we can transition our attention to the lower body. Again, the initial connection comes from our near arm, and our far arm is used to frame until we can use our lower body to do so. And in this case, it's in the form of a lasso. And once our lower body's in place, our far arm can be used as an overclasped grip to make a robust connection to the leg and begin to enter entanglements. Now, all of these are great examples of how we can connect with the far arm by staying on the same hip, but we also have the ability to switch hips to facilitate the connection with our far arm. Here we see Fionn initially framing with her far arm and making connection with her near arm. And because she has good lower body positioning, initially she takes a 2-on-1 wrist grip with that far arm, staying on her left hip. But then she uses that connection to transition into a low leg. And she uses that low leg to help her switch hips. And now what was her far arm is what she's using to make connection to the legs. Here again from the same match, you can see the far arm frames. The low leg comes in and Fionn immediately uses it to switch hips. And now what was her far arm is what she's using to make connection. As I continue to watch more matches and study guard retention, I'm looking for what people are doing with their near arm, their far arm, and their legs. and trying to piece together the order of operations and why they do what they do. And so far, to me, it seems like people are framing with their far arm and looking to make connection with their near arm. And they're only looking to connect with their far arm when they have favorable lower body position, such as a low leg or a lasso. And now that you know the rules, we can start to break them.
If you want to rock, you gotta break the rules.
Here you can see Craig makes the initial connection with his far arm, but the low leg and his connection with the near arm follow right after. So you can see the order of operations are starting to get a little blurred, but they're there nonetheless. So it's not wrong to make the initial connection with your far arm if you know the lower body positioning is coming in play shortly after. But this is turning into more of a gunslinger mentality.
I'm your huckleberry. That's just my game.
But for us normal humans, if we start off by trying to make our initial connection with our far arm, it's most likely going to lead to an easy guard pass for our opponent because we weren't able to follow it up with lower body positioning. So what I've been trying to do in my own training is, even if it's for just a brief moment, I first frame with my outside arm, whether that be on my training partner or through the form of a self frame, before the low leg comes. And now once the low leg is in place, it's okay to make connection with the far arm. And the idea is, by maintaining this order of operations, it will ingrain in me a more reliable guard retention system and will allow me to more safely make connection to a standing guard passer. Now, what we do with that connection to manage distance, destabilize, and attack our opponent is going to be a separate topic. And I think another great topic would be, how do we get layers to our defense? So when this initial guard retention layer fails, how do we recover?
Like, I'm going to put my feet on this guy. Crap, he's around shins. Crap, hands. Crap, he's way too close. I'm going to spin out. That was like 4 layers of guard retention off the top of my head.
So these are things I'm going to be studying for the next couple months. And if you enjoy this type of content, you're going to love the Outlier Database, which is a tool I built from the ground up to help connect with other jiu-jitsu nerds like yourself. So if you're interested, check the link down in the description and I'll talk to you there.